Good afternoon, everybody. Whoa. Good afternoon. Welcome. This is I'm Steve Schneck, the director of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies, and we're really pleased to see you all here today. The Institute has a long-standing practice that goes back, really goes back to the 1970s of what we call brown bag luncheons. So we have a seminar room and we invite some of our fellows to come, and people from the outside as well, to come and talk about their most recent research and so forth. And we all sit around and munch our food, and a good number of the people I see here in the room have been part of these things. We all sit around and munch our food and listen to each other's research and criticize sometimes and compliment sometimes. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been very productive, part of what we do at the Institute. And what we're hoping to do with this today and with this series of seminars, faculty seminars that we're offering this spring is something similar, but maybe just a little bit bigger. And so we're inviting all interested faculty to join us for our luncheons. I'm particularly pleased to note as well that co-sponsoring this series of talks on Catholic social teachings and public policy this spring is the Provost's office, and I'd like to thank Provost Jim Brennan for contributing and being part of today's event and helping to support this series. Thank you very much, Jim. The series that we're offering this spring is composed of 4 luncheon seminars just like this one. Today's discussion is on the topic of subsidiarity, and we're very pleased to have Professor Andrew Abella, chairman of the Department of Business and Economics, as one of our presenters here, also a fellow at the Institute, and Father Paul Sullins from the University's Department of Sociology, also a fellow at the Institute, as our presenters for today's event. The upcoming events on, I have to stop and think about the dates, on February 24th, we'll be having another faculty luncheon seminar, this time on the Catholic social teachings principle of the common good. At the end of March, on March 31st, we'll be having a seminar on the Catholic social teaching idea of solidarity. And then finally, in the middle of April, on April 14th, we'll be having our final one on the dignity of the human person. So those are the seminars that we have going forward. I'd like to thank all of you for attending. I'd also like to note, since I noticed that he's just entered the room, that we're doing this series of talks in conjunction with the celebration of President Garvey's inaugural year, and welcome President Garvey today as well. So with no more ado, let me turn this over to Dr. Brennan to make a few introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I must say that I'm delighted on behalf of the Provost Office and the Deans to be a co-sponsor for this series. On May 15th, in 1891, Pope Leo XIII, our founder, published an encyclical called Rerum Novarum, and it became the sort of seminal document of modern Catholic social teaching. And 40 years later, again coming up with a very creative title for an encyclical, the 40th year, Pope Pius XI reinforced and extended those same social teachings. So I was really delighted and happy to learn that the Institute was going to sponsor in May a conference on Rerum Novarum. And in talking about that at the very beginning of this academic year with the informal undergraduate advisory board that manages the first-year experience for our newest students, we began to say, gee, that would be a wonderful link to bring in Catholic social teachings as a theme in the first-year experience. What a wonderful way to introduce our students to the Catholic intellectual tradition. And we began to talk about that and how to do it, and it became clear in the course of that we really do need to educate ourselves on what Catholic social teaching is before we can teach it to our newest students. And that really led to this idea that came from Steve about these 4 seminars. I think as they anticipate the conference in May on Rerum Novarum, we can all participate in that conference from perhaps a more enlightened perspective as a result of these conversations. So I do want to thank Steve and the Institute, the fellows. I'm very excited about these, and I'm amazed at the kinds of feedback that I've received in the last couple of days. There's a lot, people talking about event burnout this semester. There's a lot going on right now, and yet people over the last few days have taken the time to say, gee, that's great, I want to go to that. And I can't go to the first one, but I'll be there to the second and the third. So I'm absolutely delighted about this. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to the leaders of the seminar.
Thank you so much. As has been said, I'm Father Paul Sullins. I teach in the Department of Sociology, but probably my best qualification for doing what I'm going to do today is that I also direct each year the Summer Institute of Catholic Social Thought that meets right here on the CUA campus. It's actually sponsored by several national Catholic organizations that are devoted to encouraging the development of the Catholic intellectual tradition and Catholic social thought among faculty, particularly at Catholic universities. So I won't exactly make a full shameless plug for that event, but if you keep your eyes open or you want to know more about it, you can certainly email me. And it's open to all faculty that teach in Catholic institutions. It is a small program, so it fills up fast. There's not a lot of extra room in it, but we would love to have you participate. It's a dozen faculty members from around the country who spend a week learning about Catholic social thought and then talking and wrestling with how to apply that within their own work, so to speak. Now, I'm told that I have a copious number of minutes to talk, not all of which I'm sure I'll take. As a priest, you know, I'm used to speaking for 8 minutes, so I hope that after 8 minutes I don't kind of run out of things to say here. And I'm also used to speaking before we eat, so this is really unusual for me to be speaking while you eat and for more than 8 minutes. But I'll do my best. We are wrestling with some technical issues and difficulties here, so I hope you don't mind. It reminds me of the priest who was visiting at a parish supplying Mass, and the microphone did not work properly. Now, you know, as good Catholics, that when you start off, if I were to say, "The Lord be with you," you would all say, "And also with you." We just do that automatically. So this priest, of course, said that, but nobody heard him because the mic didn't work. And so finally, he yelled out and he said, "There's something wrong with the microphone." And everybody said, "And also with you." So we talked today about subsidiarity, but this being the first of these seminars, I wanted to try and put it in a context of all of the social principles for you. And what you see in front of you is a graphic from the USCCB Office of Justice and Peace, which tries to arrange the major principles of Catholic social thought as we understand them in the modern era, modern being beginning with the aughts, the 2000s, in a way that we might be able to make sense of them. Now, I'm going to criticize and improve this graphic in a minute, but this is not a bad way to express the range of ideas in Catholic social thought. There are, as articulated in the Compendium of Catholic Social Doctrine, which provides a systematization of the kind of progressive stream of social encyclicals, there are 3 main principles of Catholic social thought which together support a what I call a hyper principle or a super principle. Others have called it the first order principle, and these others to be the second order principles. Those three principles are subsidiarity, the common good, and solidarity. This graphic tries to put those in a kind of Thomistic framework. So we have the solidarity, which relates to commutative justice. Well, actually, these three forms of justice go back to Aristotle, don't they? But contractual justice would be the justice of two individuals that enter into an arrangement, and the expectation that each party keeps their part of the arrangement. That is here related to the virtue and the social attribute of solidarity, which governs or directs our relations to one another as persons. Solidarity is the recognition of the personhood of the other in their diversity. It's not primarily empathy with that other or even identification with them, but it's recognizing their diversity and difference and liberating them to become who they are in your own personal relationship with them. And that relates here to contractual justice on this graphic. Secondly, we have the common good, which is related to general justice. So we might think of criminal law here as the kind of central point of general justice. If someone commits a crime against someone else, it's not merely a violation of a contract. It doesn't merely harm that individual. It also, in some respects, harms society. And so it diminishes the common good is the idea that's presented here. So positively, the virtue of the common good is the virtue that relates all of our actions to the good of society, that we have in mind and in practice a sense of the larger social whole, not just my own personal good, and not even just the good of a contract or a more intimate relation that I may be in. We might call the common good the principle of unity in society, and contrast that with subsidiarity, which would be the principle maybe of articulation in society. Subsidiarity here is related to distributive justice, which apportions the goods of society to the persons, I'm trying to avoid the word individuals, but it might be appropriate here, who participate in the collective goods of society. Now, the common good in Catholic social thought is not a utilitarian concept of the greatest good of the greatest number primarily. The common good recognizes those common elements of the human family or the human collectivity that are shared. And there are really two main parts of that. First are those elements of human reality that are common, that conform to the natural law, which creates a common sense of humanity. The second are those parts of the earth that we share in common, which we call in the modern discourse the commons. And so there's the universal destination of all goods, and there's the universal application via the common good to use those appropriately and properly. Now, subsidiarity relating to distributive justice, I will talk about in greater detail at this time. Now, I want to try to give you an improved version of this, maybe updated version of this. The USCCB is way ahead of most academics, in my opinion. Many academic scholars are still thinking about Catholic social thought the old way. That is, going through encyclicals and making lists of 8 principles or 12 themes and trying to relate all of those, and not in a systematized, organized fashion. In my opinion, since the publication of the Compendium of Catholic Social Doctrine in 2003, that way of doing Catholic social thought is supplanted. It is so last century. There is a better way. And it's not that we should avoid the encyclicals, but we should look at them through the way that the principles have now been organized and arranged. Maybe, what Gratian did for canon law back in the, 12th century, we're beginning to do now. We're beginning to systematize and order and arrange this body of knowledge that has kind of developed on an occasional basis for the last 100 and some years. But the USCCB may be ahead of academics, but there are a few academics that I think are ahead of the USCCB. So if I can figure out how to click this, if there's not something wrong with me here, I'll, nope, that's there. This is an improvement that's adapted from the work of Albino Barrera, who is a Dominican scholar at Providence College, who has written, in my opinion, the best stuff on Catholic social thought recently. And this is actually from a book that precedes the compendium called Modern Catholic Social Documents and Political Economy, in which he kind of foretelling the move of Pope Benedict, recast the principles of Catholic social thought in a less juridical framework and in a more, related to love framework. I think the technical word would be agapistic, but that's not a really nice word to have to roll off the tongue. So it's related more to love. Actually, we could say charismatic, because he puts it in terms of gifts. So the common good, he relates not to general justice, but to what he calls the gift of the earth, which, if you caught what I said about the universal destination of goods in its relation to the common good, is really more appropriate, more specific with regard to Catholic social thought. Subsidiarity relates to the gift of the self. We'll go into that more in a minute. And then solidarity to the gift of each other. And so in a more positive kind of expression, he's talking about giftedness. Catholic social thought is not how we relate juridically so as to do proper justice and right and wrong, but it is how we deal with the gifts that God has given us. It recognizes that life is a gift, and that if we're going to fulfill the vision of Catholic social thought, we have to ask not how do I avoid doing wrong, what's the minimum just thing that I can do, but we have to go beyond that. We have to ask how can I enter into love in this way of living. That is certainly the emphasis of Pope Benedict XVI in his first two encyclicals, right? The first one called God is Love. The second one is Love in Truth, and explicitly devoted to Catholic social thought, and focuses, as does the compendium, not on this idea of social justice, which is a little bit of a deprived notion. It's not wrong necessarily, but it takes apart and kind of puts it out of order into the center. But Pope Benedict and Albarrera focus on what should be the center, which is the development of a civilization of love, in which we don't just enact social justice. We go beyond social justice to what Benedict calls social charity. And he argues that if we don't aim for social charity, we won't even hit social justice, much less anything beyond that. Okay, now what I want to do next is to present to you a pedagogical framework that's very simple to present these ideas to students. And then I'm going to pause for any questions or comments for clarification before I move on and we talk about subsidiarity proper. So get your thoughts ready for that. And let's see if I can do this right. Okay. I present these ideas to students as talking about a three-legged stool. It's not necessarily the best image, but it really kind of resonates with them. And I say, if you just think of a stool with three legs, you've got Catholic social thought. The seat of the stool would be human dignity. That's the super principle, or the first order principle. And that stool is held up then by these three principles: subsidiarity, the common good, and solidarity. I can point out that all three principles have to be in operation. In fact, if you look closely at each of these principles, you really can't separate them out from one another in practice. We can do that analytically, but in fact, you can't be true to the principle of subsidiarity without also pursuing common good and solidarity, and they all must be kind of balanced by one another in practice. So I say, if one leg is longer than the other, the stool's going to fall down. If one leg is missing, the stool's going to fall down. And the only thing that I think is a little deficient in this image, well, not the only thing, there's always defective things in images, but what I would like to do is to find a stool where the legs are intertwined with one another, where they're braided together, because in that I think would bring out that final point. Okay, so I've presented to you three graphics which kind of provide an overview of the kind of architectonic of Catholic social thought. Before we look more closely at subsidiarity, I'd like to know if there are any kind of questions for clarification or comments of any sort, corrections where I may have led you astray. All right, how cool. This is great. Now, I just want to remind you, as good Catholics, you should never, ever let a priest get away with just talking. You should always talk back, because you can get in a lot of trouble putting too much faith in priests. Okay, let's move on and talk about subsidiarity. I presented this to students earlier, and they said, you know, you ought to go right just for this slide, so I'm skipping some slides in the middle. They said too many words. So let's just go right to the cut to the chase, which is the classical formulation of subsidiarity, which is always covered very briefly in any presentation of subsidiarity because it's opaque and complex and kind of difficult to understand, and that's even after it's translated into English. But so I have broken this up into portions that I think may make it more understandable. Certainly, Rerum Novarum assumed the principle of subsidiarity, but it wasn't until Quadragesimo Anno that it was explicitly formulated. Oops, wrong. Okay. So here's the first of three clauses that define subsidiarity, and I would like to invite Bill D'Antonio. If you can see this, you have a nice voice. Would you read that out for us?
Just as it is gravely wrong to take from individuals what they can accomplish by their own initiative and industry and give it to the community, so also it is an injustice to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do.
All right. This clause recognizes a basic distinction in social life between larger and smaller aggregates of persons. Sociologists talk about maybe the Gesellschaft and the Gemeinschaft, recognizing that there is a qualitative difference between larger, more formal, more, we might say, rationalized forms of social organization and smaller, more intimate, more personalized forms of association. Face-to-face relationships rather than distant mediated relationships. Relationships that recognize the full personality and humanity of the other in an intimate way, as opposed to relationships that are mostly mediated by roles and by offices. This clause, I suggest, assumes or recognizes that distinction and tells us that the more Gesellschaft type of social distinctions, or maybe I'm also thinking we could talk about the distinction between the Dionysian and the Apollonian, which is often used in more of the liberal arts. It says that in our individuality, our particularity, the intimacy of our relationships, that is where society should focus. That it is a dangerous and vicious tendency for society to tend toward the larger, the more impersonal. And so those larger and greater and higher associations should not presume or tread on the ground of the smaller and more intimate associations. So I'm going to say that this is the principle of smallness in society. Maybe you've read E.F. Schumacher's little book, which I can't, what was the name? Small is Beautiful, okay? Or I think it was Andrew Greeley wrote one called No Larger Than Necessary. Or the distributists back in the 30s and 40s who pointed to the smaller, more local parts of life. Quadragesimo Anno bemoaned the fact, now I'm getting ahead of myself here, but it bemoaned the fact that the rich panoply of small civic-minded groups that characterized medieval life was being lost in the modern era. And so it's putting this principle as a way of protecting that. That's important for society. All right, the next clause. Could we, Dr. Kromkowski, would you be willing to read that for us there?
For every social activity out of its own nature to furnish help to the members of the social body and never destroy and absorb them.
Okay, so if you're a larger, more powerful association, or let's say you're a superordinate office in an institution or in a government, your prime goal should be to support and to encourage the fulfillment of those weaker, smaller, more fragile components of your institution or organization. So this gets more to the heart of the notion of subsidiarity, and which is the principle of support. And then third, Dennis, could I ask you to read that? Can you see it?
Therefore, those empowered should be sure that the more perfectly a graduated order is kept among the various associations in observance of the principle of subsidiary function, the stronger social authority and effectiveness will be, and the happier and more prosperous the condition of the state.
Okay, so this would be the principle of subordination. Now, Catholic social thought assumes that society is hierarchical. You may want to interrogate that assumption, but it's built right in. Society is composed of larger and smaller social aggregates, which have higher and lower elements of responsibility. Sociologists don't have a particular problem with that. Every society kind of naturally stratifies in one way or another, and aggregates to lesser or smaller levels of hierarchy and authority. And if every society doesn't do that, certainly modern industrial society does that in spades. And so we have here a principle which argues for subsidium, support. Now, the word subsidium means, in Latin, help given from one's reserves. The subsidiary cohortes were the reserve cohorts of troops in the Roman army. They stood behind the lines. They didn't go out to the front, but they were ready to go out to the front in case, it started going badly at the front and those at the front needed it. And so the idea of subsidiarity is that the larger, stronger forces of society should hold themselves in reserve and should not presume to overwhelm or overcome the legitimate work of the smaller, more diverse parts of society or of an institution, unless those smaller parts get themselves in trouble, and in which case subsidiarity also calls for an intervention. And so the right to make that intervention is called, in the development of Catholic social thought in the 19th century, a subsidiary right. You saw that phrase in the final clause of Quadragesimo Anno. That comes out of those 19th century German social theorists who proposed that the more authoritarian elements of society should carve out space for the other parts of society to work, but should always hold a subsidiary right of intervention in case of need. This arrangement also focuses then from the larger to the smaller portions of society. It therefore directly promotes human dignity. It is, in fact, the ideal of social arrangements that are requisite for the maximum freedom of the individual, for the authentic exercise of rights and virtues. How does it do that? Well, if you think of society as a successive arrangements of smaller and more hierarchical social units, as this does, then you have at the very smallest, most intimate, but also most important institutional level of society, a very specific institution. What would that be? You all know this. The vital cell of human society, the family. And so the most important institution in society, according to Catholic social thought, is the family. It's also the smallest. And then up from that, we might think of the context in which the family works. In our society, I would think of an extended family because we kind of now have bifurcated, family life to some extent. But we might think in governmental terms. We don't have to, but in governmental terms, you would have maybe the neighborhood in which a family lives. Or maybe if you're in a condo, you've got the condo association, and then you would have maybe the town. I live in Hyattsville. It calls itself a town, so it's a town. And then we have maybe the county, and then we have a successive level, don't we, of formalized governmental hierarchies. We're going up to the nation. I think we still have nations today. And then going up to the community of nations, and then all carbon-based life forms or something. And so we have this succession of greater and more powerful. And so what this is saying is that all of those greater and more powerful units have to exist so as to support and preserve the freedom of those smaller units. But of course, what's at the center or is at the composition of the smallest unit? A family is composed of human individuals, human persons. So at the center, the focus of all of this set of ideas is the freedom of the human person to operate and to live in maximum freedom. Now, for Catholic social thought, this comes as a recognition of the fact that human fulfillment comes not through participation in society, but through achieving and finding a transcendent destiny. That each of us live in a particular, unique relationship with God, which individuates us in a certain sense, but also liberates us. But we can only be fully liberated in a society that functions in a way so as to support that. Let's see if I put this on the slide now, the next one. No. You affirm the principle of subsidiarity when you get irritated at being micromanaged. You say, that deprives me of some of my legitimacy, my freedom of operation. You also affirm the principle of subsidiarity when you get yourself in a lot of trouble and somebody more powerful comes and offers help. In fact, one of the best ways for people to connect with the idea of subsidiarity is through the idea of a subsidy, right? And I will say to students, many of you are here pursuing your education, and you have received a subsidy, a Pell Grant or some other form of subsidy from the government. Now, the government's not telling you what to study. It's not trying to, overpower your life. At least as far as I know. I'm not familiar with the intricacies of Pell Grants, but I think that's true. But yet, it's providing you some resources and support that you wouldn't have otherwise. That is a subsidiary function of the government. I said earlier that the government or the larger association should support primarily the family. So if we can imagine a state in which the government would, let's pretend, assign to certain persons the rights to marry other persons, but only some other persons, but not all other persons, right? So that maybe upper class women could only marry upper class men, or to students, I'd say, the government would say, you've got to marry this person. Would that be okay with you? Well, it's not okay with most students. Every once in a while I get one that says, okay, no, but that level of control is seen as not welcome. That's an affirmation of subsidiarity at the level of the family. The family should have the freedom to make its own decisions, and persons should have the freedom to make their own decisions. We call those freedoms in relation to society, by the way, rights. And so there's lots of rights language that could be applied here, and we may get to in a minute. But at the same time, the government reserves a right, if people forming families really screw it up, to to step in and to help make things better. Let's say you have a family where, they don't feed the children, or they lock them in a closet, or they, abuse them in some horrendous fashion. It is a good thing in society. It's an expression of subsidiarity for the government in such a case then to step in and to rescue and to restore as much as possible human flourishing and human freedom in that. So both of those are aspects of subsidiarity. I want to ask how much time I have left, because I could go on. I'm past my 8 minutes, so I'm foundering here. I mean, well,
you need to do to make this.
Don't ask. Tell me how much time. Give me
How about 10 more minutes?
10 more minutes. That's good. I can do that. All right. So on the one hand, subsidiarity opposes or resists the iron cage of meaningless efficiency that has descended upon the modern world. I hope I don't have to make a case for Weber's notion of rationalization and the depersonalization of the world that it seems to attend the development of larger industrial societies following the Industrial Revolution. It is a constant danger in our world for us to become merely, as this second quote here from Centesimus Annus, a cog in the state machine. This quote is, of course, from John Paul II, and he's criticizing bureaucratic ways of thinking that dominate government efforts rather than concern for saving their clients. Those of you in social work probably are very well attuned to this. I mean, you have an agency that is supposed to serve the homeless, and it always amazes me that agency, closes at 5 p.m. on Fridays, just when the homeless are, it's getting dark and cold and they need the most, and they're all going to go home because they're pursuing their careers. And so we can all become, in the modern world, caught up in bureaucracy, in serving ourselves. Now, to bring this a little closer to home, you have a student that wants to meet with you on a day when you're not going to be coming in to teach, or that wants too much of your time or effort. And so, do you serve the student, or do you, when do you go off the clock? Well, the whole idea of going on and off the clock, see, is a modern notion. It comes with industrial bureaucracy. So this idea gets at the root of some of these things. I have this quote in here from Aquinas, just to show you that these are not totally new ideas. Even Aquinas recognized the difficulty, and I think here he's commenting on Aristotle. He says an exaggerated standardization and conformity threatens the existence of, quote, the body politic composed of different members, just, quote, as the symphony and harmony of voices disappear when all sing the same note. This is a deep and lasting theme in Catholic thought, even though it becomes more explicitly recognized only in the last 100 years or so with Catholic social thought. Subsidiarity also opposes totalitarian tendencies of the modern state. The modern state tends not to give away authority and prerogatives to weaker parties. It tends to aggregate authority to itself, and so each of us, as Quadragesimo Anno says, stands as an individual against the state, and we are in danger of being overpowered by that state. Pope Benedict 2 years ago said subsidiarity is the most effective antidote against any form of all-encompassing welfare state. So it's not just the malevolent totalitarian states that characterized the first part of the 20th century, but also the more benevolent totalitarian states that are common in our day that are seen to violate the, or at least to trip over this idea of subsidiarity. On the other hand, subsidiarity supports and promotes the following two items: a rich civil society with a diverse ecology of mediating institutions. Quadragesimo Anno, well, I already referred to this. This is where I got ahead of myself, that it laments the decline and loss of that rich social life, a vibrant ecology of civic associations. And so that there, and I just quoted this, the remains only virtually individuals against the states. Its subsidiary also supports certain duties which are unique and proper to states, certain persistent duties which are necessary for the development of smaller association and human individuality. And these include, I don't think that this list is exhaustive, but I think this is that somewhat famous list from Centesimus Annus 48 that includes individual freedom and private property. Catholic social thought has always affirmed private property as necessary for human flourishing and dignity. Also stable currency, also efficient public services, also the prevention of monopolies that obstruct free enterprise. And then the fifth one there, it seems to me, just repeats the basic principle and idea of subsidiarity. So finally, and I'm just going to sum up here. There seems to me two main ideas that we should keep in mind in thinking about subsidiarity. First, it calls for a balance. It doesn't oppose or preclude government intervention, but sets certain specific conditions for that intervention to occur. So government intervention should be, quote, neither invasive nor absent, but commensurate with society's real needs. And then second, it calls for respect. And to me, this is the kind of best and highest idea to end with. This is comes from the most recent social encyclical just 2 years ago, in which the Pope said, subsidiarity respects personal dignity by recognizing in the person a subject who is always capable of giving something to others. Thank you for your attention. Yeah. Now, we agreed that we would have questions for clarification at this time. And then if there are any questions that get into more meaty, substantive, controversial matters, that we'll hold that until after both presentations. So yes, sir.
Should I assume from the examples that the principle of subsidiarity is not applicable to the analysis, say, of the way in which the Catholic Church and its individual members interact with each other?
No, you shouldn't assume that. In fact, I think it was Pius XII explicitly promoted the application of subsidiarity to the Church's internal functionings itself. Yeah, and of course the Church is obviously a hierarchical institution. So how the Church treats the weakest, the most defenseless, local, is very much encouraged by subsidiarity, even we might say small worshiping groups, right? So, all right, thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Father. Really delighted to be here. One of the main reasons I came to Catholic 8 years ago was to be able to participate in fora like this, to be in a community of scholars who cared about Catholic social teaching. And I, shortly after arriving here, around the time when Monsignor Higgins died, and I inherited his library of Catholic social. Now, how did that come to be? I have no relation to him, but he actually left everything to Catholic U and his books to the library. Unfortunately for the library, fortunately for me, he had a habit of copiously annotating all of his books. And the library, for some reason, won't accept anything that's already written in. And I happened to be there the day they were about to get rid of them all, and I said, oh, I know what to do with those. So my favorite volume in that collection is a copy of Michael Novak's The Spirit of Capitalism and the Catholic Ethic, very heavily annotated, with words like, you must be joking. And that's it's a fascinating, it's really, I'm thinking I will get permission from Michael Novak someday to maybe print sort of a facsimile edition if anybody wants to see those notes. Anyway, my job is to take what Father Paul has shared with you and do some sort of practical application, examples of practical application. And there are very, very many, as you can imagine, not just in governmental institutions, social institutions, commercial institutions. So the way companies are managed, for example, you can see the application. People have done work in the application of subsidiarity there. Within universities, how universities are managed. What I thought I would focus on, though, particularly with reference to that the totalitarian tendency of modern society that Father talked about, is look a little bit at the current kind of economic problems that we have right now and see what insights subsidiarity can offer. And I want to start out by looking at the phenomena of large corporations. It's interesting, but in certain groups of scholars or activists who are very enthusiastic about the application of subsidiarity to government, so they want small government, they seem to sort of give a pass to the application of subsidiarity to big business. Businesses, as you know, in the modern world, can get to be very, very large. Some years ago, somebody compiled a list of the top 100 largest countries in the world, and then mixed up that list and allowed in corporations, and corporations held 51 of the top 100 spots. That has shifted a little bit since then. This was kind of in terms of measuring GNP and corporate revenues. But even today, for example, Walmart is larger than Denmark in terms of economic output. So why we would ignore corporations when we think about subsidiarity, I don't think we should. Particularly where we have a situation like today, where a few very, very large entities dominate much of our commercial activity. In the United States, about 0.3% of all our firms produce more than half of our non-farm output. So this is a very, very small number of companies, a very significant impact. And the argument usually raised is, well, there's one government, and if you don't like the government, you're stuck at least until the next election, right? Whereas if you don't like a particular company, you don't have to do business with them. But that's sort of a superficial response, because there are many ways in which companies that you never invest in or do business with can affect you, right? There are all sorts of externalities. So businesses are run, at least the motivation of those who run them is to maximize profits. Many negative externalities can arise from that, right? Things like sort of obvious ones like environmental pollution, but also cultural pollution. I've never invested in Viacom, but the effect of MTV on the youth of our society is something I live with every day, and so if I have objections to that, there's really not that much I can do, because they have such a dominant share of the sort of the media impact on youth. But also even sort of local economic shocks. A company may shut down a plant, practically devastate a community, whether or not that community, people in that community ever sort of try to do business with that company. Anyway, so big these negative externalities that we are all subject to. The way we try to deal with those typically is through regulation, through government regulation. It's not clear whether we are justified in putting very much faith in regulation, for a couple of reasons. More broadly, because of the likelihood of unintended consequences. The enormous complexity of modern society means that it's pretty much impossible to forecast, to predict the consequences of most attempts at regulation. Things end up happening that you didn't intend. Things end up not working the way you intended them. And so, and then more specifically, we have the phenomenon of what is called regulatory capture. I want to get a sense of how many people have heard this phrase or are familiar with regulatory capture. Okay, a couple of people, the lawyers in the room. For the rest of you, in effect, this is first identified or named by George Stigler, a Nobel Prize-winning economist back in the 1970s. And what he kind of noted was that whenever you have regulation of a few larger entities, right, for the benefit of many smaller ones, so for consumers typically, so you regulate electrical utilities, for example, for the benefit of us consumers, what tends to happen over time is that the regulatory activity or oversight is captured by those being regulated, because their interest in that regulation is so much greater and they are so much more easily organized, right, than the millions of consumers who are supposed to benefit from the regulation. So if you think about, just staying with electrical utilities, think about how much time you spent thinking about the price of electricity in the last month, right? Probably a few seconds while you wrote your check to your utility, you curse, you send it in, and you're done. Compare that to how much effort do you think the utilities spend thinking about that, where that's sort of life or death for them, right? So and this happens across many industries, many occasions. And so you see the problem, you come up with the regulation, and then you hope the problem is taken care of, but by and large, usually it isn't. And so what what I think we have occurring is this gross violation of subsidiarity where big business and big government are sort of feeding off each other. So where you have big business leads ultimately to bigger government, because you have a big entity that some people consider as doing some harm, then you need an even bigger entity to regulate it, but that regulation doesn't end up being very effective. And so there's more regulation to try to collect the first regulation, and the thing looks pretty unpleasant. Give you some examples. So food safety is an issue that has come up sort of time and time again over the past few years. People get diseases from food. And so we attempt to come up with, there are a number of attempts to come up with laws to correct for food safety, to make the food supply safer. One such attempt a couple of years ago was called the National Animal Identification Scheme. The idea was, if there's an outbreak of E. coli or something like that, we need to be able to track what animals that came from and then go and exterminate that herd. Makes kind of sensible idea, right? The problem is, in some cases, you have herds of 5,000, 10,000 swine or cows, and you don't really want to go in there and be tagging every one of those. So sure, the regulation said you could just have a group identification for that herd. But if you have a small farm, the regulation said you actually have to tag so you run around, tag every chicken, every cow that you have. And you can see the sort of the imbalance here. And this is this in the collusion between big business and big government, what you end up getting is the ones who hurt are not just the consumers, but also the smaller businesses, right? Who are not often invited into the discussions when these regulations are being made. Think about the financial regulations that the recent act that passed. The financial system is so complicated, the global financial system is so complicated, that the only people who understand it are the people who work in the industry. And so when they're looking for people to regulate it, they hire people from the industry. So you end up having, same in the pharmaceutical business, right? So you have the same people moving from big business to big government and back again, regulating this thing supposedly for the common good. And I'm not saying there's ever any negative intention or evil intention here, but the actual fact ends up being we get the crises that we have been experiencing. When you study these things from an economic perspective, we find, for example, that small enterprises always suffer, almost always suffer as a result of regulation. When we calculate the costs of dealing with regulation, small companies, typically measured as people with employees of 20 employees or fewer, pay about 44% more in terms of the cost of conforming to regulation, about 300% more in terms of environmental regulation. So the cost of regulation falls very, very unfairly proportionately on the smaller enterprises, when, ironically, it's the smaller enterprises who are the lesser problem, because it's easier to regulate. If your neighborhood grocery store is dumping stuff out the back that's harmful to the environment, you just walk in there and say, look, I can see what you're doing, stop it. And if they want their business to survive, they will stop it. So there's no official regulation even needed, arguably. And yet they pay the higher price for regulation. So there's a certain injustice and certainly ineffectiveness here. So what can you do? You have large corporate. There's one thing we do is we have a whole movement in corporate social responsibility. We try to educate corporations to have a social conscience and so on. That's never going to be perfect, right? So there's always we need some kind of check on antisocial behavior. But if that check in the form of regulation doesn't seem to be very effective, now what? And so I want to suggest three insights from subsidiarity that I think could help us in this way. The first would be to look for a more level playing field between the larger and smaller enterprises. One can argue that large corporations get to be their size and stay the size that they are, not just because they're more successful. Because that's usually the first pushback. What do you have against big companies? That's just, big company is just a small company that's been very successful. What do you have against success? At a certain point, a larger company is able to invest in things like lobbying and build itself unfair kind of barriers to entry, say, to competition, or regulations that are onerous enough that only companies of a certain size can deal with. And so if we, so this comes from a public policy perspective, found a way to say that there can be no subsidy or no benefits to corporations where size would give you any kind of advantage. So for example, when Walmart moves into a town and ends up wiping out a lot of the small local businesses, oftentimes the local council gives Walmart, say, a 10-year tax holiday. But the local hardware store never got any kind of tax holiday. You know? So if we say that any such benefit had to be given to every economic entity regardless of size, I think that would help here. The reverse too, any regulation has to fall evenly across all sizes of economic entities. And what that often means is that for the smallest entities, you just give them there's kind of a floor below which let them run free or have very, very minimal regulation, because, as I say, it's so much easier to regulate. The local community can more easily regulate a small enterprise. So that's one idea, the sort of leveling of the playing field. Right now, it seems to be very tilted in the favor of larger enterprises. The second is to draw a distinction between two fundamental types of regulation. Regulation, on the one hand, of activity and outcome. Regulation, on the other hand, of size, pure and simple. When you think about the regulation of the banks after the Great Depression, that was pretty much a regulation of size. You can't have more than X number of branches. You can't do business in more than X, usually one state. You know, so just kind of fairly straightforward. Regulation of size is fairly easy to do. It doesn't take an army of bureaucrats to say, hey, you're only allowed to have 3 outlets, you're opening up a 4th one, stop it. It doesn't take much effort. But regulation of outcomes or of activities is much, much more complicated and does need an army of bureaucrats to track and enforce and so on. So the EPA, for example, that's all based on outcomes and activities, right? So that's why we have that enormous building and many other on Constitution Avenue and many others around the country. Antitrust regulation is based on outcomes, not on size, right? Because we make assessments to try to think, does a company of this certain size, is it in any way affecting does it have an undue market power, right? But it's nothing to do with the actual size itself. It's just its relative market power. And the problem with these two differences, so I mentioned that one is much easier to regulate than the other. It doesn't take as much effort. But you think about what's happening in the financial industry. I mentioned the 30s, so we had the regulation then, which was based on size. We had deregulation in the 1980s. The crises that followed that. Now we have re-regulation, and it's sort of okay. So we had regulation, and that was good, and then we had deregulation, and that had bad outcomes. So now we have re-regulation, so we expect that to have good outcomes. The problem is it's now a different kind of regulation. The new financial regulation, the new legislation that has passed, is of activities and outcomes now. It's no longer regulation of size. And it seems to me that the regulation of activities and outcomes is the problematic type of regulation, and that's the direction we have been moving steadily over the decades. So that's the second one, the distinction between the two different types of regulations. And then the third one, a little more complicated, but it seems to me, and maybe I just have a bias because I've done quite a bit of work in this area, but that consumerism, the desire to kind of find fulfillment in life through consumption of material goods, is a big part of the problem here. If the pursuit of happiness in our contemporary society wasn't so tightly bound up with material consumption, and therefore if we weren't so determined to get the best price on everything, then the scale economies that come from large enterprises wouldn't matter as much. And therefore, the obsession with large size and large run scale economies and so on wouldn't be as great. Now, I racked my brains over the years to figure out what sort of public policy initiatives could help minimize consumerism, and I've been beaten up in journals for being naive about my suggestions. One sort of the most obvious one that tends to come up is a consumption tax. I'm not even sure that actually would work very well. A consumption tax will be effective in reducing consumption. I don't think it's effective in reducing consumerism, because it's that desire for stuff. And if stuff is more expensive, that doesn't usually actually stop you from desiring it. In fact, can have oftentimes the opposite. A tax on mass advertising would be interesting, right? If you were able to reduce the amount of mass advertising, though as a professor of marketing, that would be a serious career-limiting move were I to ever propose that in public. Another one, maybe a bit more creative, would be more government support for families with children. Families with larger numbers of children don't tend to be as consumeristic because you just can't. You're just too distracted with kind of the activity with the kids. So I kind of end on that sort of note of sort of a question mark with the three insights: the level playing field, the distinction between two different types of regulation, and then some way of reducing consumerism as insights, I think, from the principle of subsidiarity for dealing with the economic malaise that we are in right now. I realize I can be working at a very sort of high level, but we have a short amount of time. I wanted to sort of throw the ideas out for discussion. Thank you. Sure, okay.
Okay, let's take Jim Lowen. I saw his hand up.
Different kind of maybe subsidiarity. I'm not sure I understand the term. I never heard of it before this announcement for this forum, so I'm glad to learn it. But my question is, and it relates to economics in a way, but in a different sense. It seems to me, at least in the popular discussion of these matters, that Toyota has a whole lot more subsidiarity than, say, GM. That historically, at least like 20 years ago, it was famous for having work groups that actually had some power, that made some decisions around things, could even criticize parts and get different parts and so on, whereas GM was all top down. This hasn't worked too well for GM. I don't remember a bailout of Toyota. And I'm wondering if that is subsidiarity and if therefore it has some applicability to firms, including to very large firms.
Yes, you're exactly right. It is. And there have been some applications to corporations. Generally, the management literature talks about centralization versus decentralization and hierarchy, but there have been actually some scholars who've applied the principle of subsidiarity to corporate management. And certainly I think it does, it applies to any human institution, for-profit, not-for-profit, and so on.
Jim, you're familiar with the name Rensis Likert, been to the Likert scale. He wrote a book on human organization. I think it's called The Human Organization or something like that. In that book, he contrasts organizations that are more centralized, more hierarchical, more top-heavy, with those that are more, he says, democratic, more level, and compares, studies actual corporations, and comes up with an efficiency gain with less centralization, which I think is about 20%. So, if you can move from more hierarchical to less hierarchical, the point of that book is you can increase the efficiency of the organization by about 20%. I don't know what 20% of Catholic University's budget is, but if you could have a few extra 10 million, but that would of course assume that Catholic University is very hierarchical and can move. So, whose hand did I see next? Right back there, David Walsh.
Okay. Well, one of the, and I think the two talks nicely illustrated probably the question that I have, because they move from the very general down to the very specific controversies. And that seems to, that you could say it's the transition from the general to the specific that really is kind of the problematic area in terms of Catholic social thought. We could certainly remain on the general level, but when we get down to the specific, then the question is, how do the general principles instruct us, and so on. One of the great tendencies is to present Catholic social thought as the answer. But the only problem is that, well, we've lost the question. I want to know what the question is to which it is the answer. And, in many ways, it's almost impossible to sharpen it up as a topic for discussion unless you have the questions. The general principles arise out of rather local, specific, historical settings in which, the principle of subsidiarity arose in Quadragesimo Anno because everybody was concerned about the huge concentrations of economic power. That was the central issue. And subsidiarity is a principle that gets formulated in that context. Is that really our problem? And what does subsidiarity mean in light of our problems? And what are our problems?
Right. Let me make a couple of comments, then Andrew may have something actually sensible to say to that. I just wanted to note, you're pointing out something very important about what we do as scholars. Catholic social thought is not something that's separate from the kind of normal or central moral theology of the church. Catholic social thought is a species of moral reasoning. So when we begin to think about human society and we talk about some as better or worse, we're imposing certain moral standards on society, and we have the problem which is endemic to any form of moral reasoning, which is how to take general principles and apply them to specific cases, right? And that transition is a problem that I think is part of the nature of the discourse in moral reasoning. You might say it's the nature of any Platonic view of understanding, is how to relate the form to the particular. In the social teachings of the church, well, in kind of generic moral thought, you have two sets of statements then. You have general propositions, and which you then have to relate to guidelines for particular action, right? In Catholic social thought, it proposes that there is a middle level that's necessary, and this is called criteria for judgment, which tries to relate, as you're saying, those kinds of general principles. You know, we want to end up with, what do I do personally to behave right and wrong? But we have this middle level where we have to say, well, what do we all do? What does our society do in order to promote the exercise of virtue? I just can't do it in a vacuum. You're right that that's a very difficult thing. There are no clear answers. I like to say that there is, Catholic social thought is a misnomer. We have to talk about the huge variety of Catholic social thoughts that we all have as we apply these general principles to very particular situations. Well, that's just my comments that your question has sparked. Is there something?
Yeah, just very quickly, pick any social question. So I'm obviously looking at more economic questions, and looking at the current economic problems. And so what subsidiarity says to those is if the corrections that we're seeking violates the principle of subsidiarity, then chances are 5 or 10, and I think they are, and I think fairly demonstrably so, then 5 or 10 years from now we are going to be in far worse economic shape than we are now, which is what nobody wants and is hoping for. Right? So that's kind of a very broad response, but I think you take any, this is what's to me is so attractive about the principles, is you take any social issue, political, social, economic, so on, the principles provide insights that oftentimes don't come from anywhere else. Nobody's talking about subsidiarity. People never heard the word now. In the discussions about regulation, nobody is considering, well, maybe the banks are just too darn big. You know, there's all this talk about too big to fail, and then they didn't fail because we propped them up, and then nobody says that anymore. They're even bigger than they were, you know.
This gentleman right here, I think I saw next.
Yeah, I was curious, because I think you're, you know, where I read in contemporary discourse, and most obviously in the discussion over healthcare about subsidiarity, it's only coming from the right way as a criticism of the administration's healthcare plan.
Right.
And in that, in 2 of your slides, one was from the bishops. It was curious how the arrow only went from society to the individual on that part of the triangle.
Good.
It seems to me that that's part of the misunderstanding, and it's in that one also.
Yeah, right.
Where it seems to me that the arrow has to be going in both directions,
Yeah.
if I understand what you were talking about.
No.
The other is more directed, and I'm assuming it was yours, which is the only time you use the word totalitarian was in the application of Caritas and Veritate.
Yeah.
And not curiously in the encyclical written in 1931, where I think it was actually a much more live concern to which subsidiarity was a response. And it's not a word to use loosely in reference where the last line there was welfare state. And so was there more there than I was?
No, Quadratus Milano goes to great lengths to denounce totalitarian, that thing. And I didn't mean to imply by selecting one quote over another any distinction among those. I guess I opted to include that particular one because that's the kind of totalitarian tendency that we face today. We don't really have, as far as I know, states that are, gassing their citizens in great numbers today, or the active gulags are kind of a thing of the past. Maybe not, as far as I know. But that's me. I just want to comment on the healthcare debate. I was amused by the fact that people speaking for it would emphasize solidarity. People speaking against it would emphasize subsidiarity. I heard this kind of almost conflicted discourse there. Okay, Bill, I saw you.
Yes, Paul, before your opening discussion of subsidiarity and its relationship to common good and solidarity, I have to admit that I had always thought of them in terms of our political economic systems worldwide. But as I listened to you and I thought about the data that I've been collecting all these years on real living Catholics, I wondered if I could apply some of these principles to what's going on in the church. That Vatican II was a case of solidarity, bishops meeting together, voting on new ways of being Catholic, and of course among those was freedom of conscience, affirming it, and giving the notion of the people of God. Well, at the subsidiarity level, it looks like over the 40-some years, well, it's 50 years since Vatican II, that the Catholics have taken seriously the notion of subsidiarity, and now there's a sensus fidelium regarding birth control. They're using their conscience, living experience, and reason, and they concluded that, in fact, the majority of the Birth Control Commission was right, and the Pope was wrong. Now, the Pope's response, of course, was Humani Vitae, a statement from Solidarity, or at the top. But we see what happens when authority is perhaps, I'm not going to use the word misplaced, but is simply not taken seriously. Would I be wrong to start trying to use these principles to look at some of our findings that, in fact, at the level of individuals and family, the core of society, we find people using more and more what I would call reason, lived experience, to decide how they behave within this larger organization, the church.
Well, you're asking me that question, and you know.
Well, in other words,
you know what I'm going to answer, Bill.
Well, I'm looking at, where I might find some literature for others, theologians who have in fact used the principles.
Well, I would answer it, yes, you would be wrong, because the proper role of revelation in the Catholic Church does not begin with the laity.
What?
Does not begin with the laity. Does this work?
No.
All right. It's in the Protestant church that the laity have a direct connection to God to formulate their own notions of doctrine. But as a Catholic, we believe that God has revealed himself in a particular way in Christ, and that revelation is carried forward and communicated to us through the magisterium of the church. Now, we may not like or we may not agree with the magisterium, but that's definitive of our notion that we're dealing, in the case that you're citing, with revealed truth. It's not induced truth. It's not something that we can even come to by the basis of our own process of reasoning. So you can accept that or you cannot accept that. I don't put any particular negative evaluation on either choice you make, but if you choose not to accept that, then you're stepping outside of what is necessary for a person to be a Catholic thinker, to have that submission of will and intellect that we heard President Garvey profess to the magisterial teachings of the Catholic faith. If you want to dissent with that, if you want to fight with the Pope, God bless you, you do that, but it's really not appropriate Catholic thinking. So, I mean, that's my answer. We've had this conversation many times, and it's what I would say to that, but I imagine there may be other answers that are bubbling up in this room that people would like to comment.
Sounds like GM though.
In terms of doctrine, I mean, if you're dealing with revealed truth, you have to accept that revelation.
Well, you stated the position of
Yeah.
whether that's a...
Yeah.
That's
But
the
now,
problem.
if you're talking about the process, that maybe the bishops have stifled expressions of dissent or have had repressed individuals, then you have an excellent point, and I could see that. But in the, as you know, in the development of Humanae Vitae and Medical Practice, they did consult lay people to a great extent. So I don't know that they violated subsidiarity in that regard, but we could have that conversation.
Well,
Yes.
let's just-
Dennis, say something.
There's
Lead
Luke
us onward.
chapter 12 there that seems to get slid by. But I will discuss that later.
We could.
I want to talk to a slightly different point. I was supposed to put this in context of subsidiarity. The principle leaves considerable room for intervention by higher levels when necessary. And in this context, reference to dignity,
Right.
one can quarrel about whether an intervention is appropriate, and that's where push comes to shove. But it doesn't seem to be fundamentally inconsistent with the principle. But what I want to go back to was on the general principles I think are extremely important in how it guides one's daily life and evaluation of public policy and so on. There's one element that perhaps you skip by a bit, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in
Sure.
emphasizing the significance of this. But it did come up in a couple of the quotes, is when one moves from the individual and the family as the core institutions of life, it doesn't simply go then to local government and on up the scale toward the state. But there's a huge area of private association
Oh, yeah.
that people develop in their church, in their community, in other associations, even in the workplace, which is tremendously rich in how people exercise their autonomy, develop their self. And my sense is that subsidiarity suggests a preference for the local and decentralized over the larger, but also in a sense toward the private over the public,
Yeah.
in that private sense of rich association, with that big caveat that there is considerable room for levels of the state to interfere when necessary to facilitate.
You are absolutely right. A number of writers have cited subsidiarity as the basis for the distinction between the state and society, and the kind of almost the definition of the private individual. The whole notion of mediating institutions, private associations, the whole Tocquevillian idea is very much supported by and consistent with the notion of subsidiarity. I had several paragraphs and slides on that, but when I tried this out on students, they said, no, don't go there. That's not necessary. But you're absolutely right. Yes, sir.
Just a quick point on our colleague left with his dog a minute ago. He was raising a question about Toyota. And you can try to find some connections to whatever specific problems or observations you have about social phenomena, Bill's included, and try to find some connections to something within this body of, as Father Stillings points out, this is not really an analytical explanation. This is a set of advice, exhortations, suggestions about a consistent way of looking at person, society, governance, with a lot of room for really serious questions about what precisely these things mean. One of the points that this question about the organization of the enterprise relates to is not related to this at all, but related to some other parts of this doctrinal approach, and that's worker co-determination, where workers are actually engaged in the enterprise and in the common good of the enterprise, and bring some measure of insight and experience to make something better in his eyes. That is, that you can find certain texts within which you can find an anchor to speak about whatever you wish to speak about. But that puts the person who is trying to look at very specific regime or societal issues that are concrete, searching for doctrinal texts that warrant one thing or another about the position. Now that puts researchers in a pretty complicated kind of issue, kind of situation, because Are we looking for explanations? Is there, let me put it to you very frankly, is there anything more in this whole system than the exercise of prudence is a prudent thing?
Well, I think that subsidiarity is if there is, and God hope there is.
Well, prudence is the highest virtue. Prudence brings all these practical virtues together and is the connecting point between the theoretical life and the practical life.
Yeah.
So if there is more to this than prudence applied is prudent, then I have to be convinced. Now, I don't want to know about doctrine, but I want to know about the directions that come from this body. And I'm saying this as a risk of, I'm going to have to say something about solidarity in a couple of weeks, but I think we should get this out at this point now, and I'm prompted by my colleague David Walsh to bring this to the fore, because he did it in a more gentle form than I did.
So is there content? Is there unique content to each of these principles? I think this subsidiarity would be the easiest one to demonstrate, because the assumption that you should prefer the smaller local entity over the larger is not one that is self-evident. I don't think. If it is,
but it doesn't apply to Bill's case.
I see where you're going. I see what you're saying. It's not an absolute preference, but that's clear, because then that would be nonsensical, right? Because that mean any kind of authority would be condemned by this, which would be an absurd thing to claim.
No, the lowest form of authority would be preferred.
Yeah, but it's not.
Right.
It's not authority,
Except-
right? Because it's just
except
self.
when? I mean, what is the exception?
No, it's not simply authority, I'm sorry, this doesn't work. It's each association pursuing what is most proper to it. So a family pursues those activities that are proper to the family. Now, another part of
Like a restaurant?
Well, another part of subsidiarity that we could actually put in quadragesimal arrow talks about, what if you have two associations on the same level, and they start to do things that are outside of their own kind of proper autonomy or sphere, then subsidiarity would call for each of those to respect the proper ability and autonomy of all the other. Not just with respect to the hierarchy. This actually relates to solidarity, because solidarity, of course, is the recognition of the diverse roles and participation in society, very much similar to the Durkheimian notion of solidarity. And so subsidiarity would call for our understanding that each set of associations has its own proper autonomy. It gets even more complicated than that, because when you talk about groups of a person or a higher authority restraining from imposing its will on lower authorities, often that higher and that lower authority are the same person or the same groups of persons. So you don't just have separate groups, but you have persons who participate in succeeding levels of authority and responsibility. So you have a single person who may, in one role, we talk, be the CEO of a firm, and in another role may be a husband in a family, and in another role may be a voter in participating in the political process. And so subsidiarity calls for the proper articulation of each of those roles, even when the persons within them will overlap.
Who determines what's proper?
Could I make a quick suggestion? We've hit the 2 o'clock mark, and I know a number of people have to leave, including myself. But maybe we can just move to sort of more informal discussion for who remains.
That would be great.
Yeah, thank you.
Census reading.